So at the end of last week, we began the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Beis in the wide ones. And in all the cases in the Mishnah, we were trying to figure out if this woman was the Yevamot Ashuk in a tragic situation where her husband, both her husband and her son, went out to Medinas Hayam, and the Eidim testified that unfortunately they both perished. And the main issue is sequence. Who died first? Was it the husband or was it the son? In event that the son died first, then after the husband dies, second, her status is that of Yevamot Ashuk. She falls for Yibum. And if she goes ahead and gets married to someone else, then we have to break up that marriage. But if, on the other hand, the husband died first, that means he left the son alive at the moment of his death, there's no nefila for Yibum. And as far as the other Achim is concerned, she retains her status as an Eishes Ab. So the Mishnah, if you recall, presents a number of different scenarios. Let's just quickly look inside the Mishnah and review them. We're not going to read every word of the Mishnah, but just to have a safe takeoff. The first case is the Eidim testified that the husband died first. And then the son died. So there was never an Afila for Yibum. And based on the testimony of these two Eidim, she got married to someone from the Shuk. And then either the first pair of Eidim themselves, or more likely a second pair of Eidim, testified Chiluf Advar. Everything went in the opposite direction. And in fact, it wasn't her husband that died first, but rather it was her son who died first, which means that she was the Yevamot Ashuk. And the Mishnah says in such a case, Teitzei Rishon V'Achron. And that means that since there was a Zikas Yibum based on the second pair of Eidus, she was Asura L'Shuk, she got married. The child from such a marriage is considered a mamzer, terrible mamzer. When I say terrible, I don't mean he's terrible. I mean mamzer is a very terrible status to be in. It's a psul yuchsin. And as you know, a mamzer can only marry a mamzeres or a giores. And when it says here Rishon V'Achron, it means it's irrelevant whether she became pregnant before she heard the second pair of Eidim or after she heard the second. Then we go on to case number 2, which is codified here in the Mishnah. And here the Eidim testified just the opposite, that her son died first, and then her husband died. What happened? She fell for Yibum. V'nisyabma. What is it? V'nisyabma. I mean, you can imagine the joy at the ceremony. But v'achakach omelach chiluf hayadvarim, which means that it wasn't your son who died first, but rather it was your husband who died first. In which case the Yavam is living with his Eishes Ach, with an Ereva, because there is no Zikas Yibum. Is then in such a case takes a Vlad Rishon V'Achron Mamzer. And again, it doesn't matter at what point the Yibum took place, whether it's before the second pair of Eidim testified or afterwards. In either event, the child of this marriage is a mamzer, because if a man violates an Isur Ereva, in this case Eishes Ach, and that we only know after the Yibum, unfortunately, we found that after the Yibum, but in MS, he is violating the Isur Eishes Ach, and the pregnancy and the birth that took place as a result of this Ereva of Eishes Ach creates mamzeros. Then we get to the third case. Here's a case where the Eidim testified that her husband died first, and therefore she's not a Yevamot Ashuk. He left a son, and she got married. V'akach omrula kayim choya. That your husband is still alive. As an Ashes Ish, you were living with another man. Umes, and now her husband dies, finally dies. I mean, before we thought he died, but it turns out he was alive. Now we know he's dead. Teitzei. Now again, you might ask, what do you mean Teitzei? At this point, the husband is dead. So that now she's allowed to be married to someone else. But no. We go back to the moment, the critical moment that she married him. And at that moment, she was an HSC getting married to another man. Is therefore, even after her husband dies subsequently, Teitzei, she has to be removed. You have to break up the Ishus to the second husband. And even though now the husband is dead, so the second husband should be able to be Makayim. No. We're going to apply the principle of Knas and Havlad Rishon v'Achron Mamzer. No, I'm sorry. HaRishon Mamzer v'Achron Eino Mamzer. In other words, although the Knas imposes upon the second husband, in quotation, a chiyuv, an obligation to divorce his wife, if he didn't do so, and he lived with her, the child is not a mamzer. Although he violated a knas d'Rabbanan, a rabbinic action and prohibition, but he doesn't create mamzeros. If, on the other hand, in the context, in the framework of this marriage to the second husband, she became pregnant while the husband, her first husband, was alive, then clearly the child is a mamzer. And finally, we end up the Mishnah with the following case. Two witnesses testified falsely. They plagiarized themselves. No, not plagiarized, perjured themselves. I always confuse those. They perjured themselves. And they claimed that your husband died, she got married. And now the question is, what was the level of the marriage to the second husband? Miss Kadsha, if she did not have any intimate relationship with this second husband, it was just Kiddushin. The Akaf Bo Bailo, now we find out that these two witnesses that testified that her husband died had perjured themselves. Muteres Lachzolo, she could go back and remarry her first husband. I mean, she doesn't have to remarry him because she was never divorced from him. And the chiddush here is, even if her first husband is a Kohen, and even if the second husband would deliver a get to her, so it looks like she's a grusha, nevertheless, he can still remain married to her. And we're not going to consider her a grusha because she has no marriage relationship whatsoever with the second husband, because her first husband, Baruch Hashem, even as we speak, is alive and well. Which would mean that even if her husband, her current, who's the original husband, way back when, is a Kohen, she can go back to him. And it also means that if he dies, she can marry a Kohen, even though she has a get in her hand. How can you have a woman who's a grusha, has a get in her hand, and she's allowed to marry a Kohen? That'd be an interesting quiz question. And the answer is, in a case where she can receive this get from a second husband, when in fact her first husband was alive and well. And so Darash Rabbi Elazar ben Masya, this is how we finished up on Yom Chamishi. Isha grusha meisha v'lo meish she'eno isha. That when the Torah prohibits a Kohen from marrying a grusha, the Torah went out of its way to be mamayit and restrict that Isur to a case of grusha meisha. Meisha means from her husband. She got to get from her husband. And it's coming to exclude ish she'ena isha, this other marriage partner, so to speak, who's not really married to her at all legally because she was an isha, her husband's still alive, and his get is not a valid get. It doesn't register to make her into a grusha. So that's a summary of the highlights of what we learned on Yom Chamishi. So now at this point, the Gemara is going to go back to analyze the very first segment of the Mishnah, the scenario in which a Yevama, mistakenly thinking that she's not no fellas leave, or she got married to someone min hashuk, and we said that the Vlad is a mountain. Why? What does the Mishnah mean when it uses these two terms, Rishon and Ach? My Rishon, umay Ach. And the Gemara is going to go through two possibilities. Possibility number one, to interpret the Mishnah Lema, Rishon lifnei Shmua, the Achron liachar Shmua. Rishon means that she became pregnant in an innocent situation, meaning lifnei Shmua, before she even knew that she would fall for evil, that she really did fall for evil, because she was under the impression that her husband died first, and then the son died, and therefore she got married to someone min hashuk. That's called Rishon lifnei Shmua. The Achron liachar Shmua. After she heard the news of Chiluf HaDvarim, that in fact it was the other way around, and it was the son who died first, and then subsequently her husband died, which means that she falls for evil because at his death he had no children. Then she became pregnant after having heard that she is the Yevamot Ashur. If that's the interpretation of our Mishnah, listening Havlad Mamzer, the Mishnah did not have to qualify that Havlad Mamzer Rishon v'Achron. Why? Because whether it was before Shmua or after Shmua, whether she knew and had heard the second pair of Eidim that in fact her son died first, doesn't matter. Now she knows that it wasn't her son who died first. I'm sorry, that it wasn't her husband who died first, but rather it was her son who died first. Chiluf HaDvarim. Who cares when she got pregnant, whether it was before she heard or she didn't hear? The bottom line is that we have clear-cut evidence, Chiluf HaDvarim, that in fact the son died first. She was the Yevamot Ashur. And therefore, when she marries this other fellow from the Shuk, the child is a mamzer. You don't have to tell me Rishon v'Achron. Just tell me a Vlad mamzer, Stam, what we call Stam. Now, very often in this kind of case, the Gemara comes up with a chidush, ma'u detema, then a kamashma. We would have thought somehow that the Vlad is not a mamzer. And that can only be explained on a D'Rabbanan level. But here, we don't have a D'Rabbanan level. We're talking about a bona fide D'Oraisa. We now know clearly that her son died first and her husband died last, which means that she falls for evil. Obviously, if she falls for evil and she went ahead and got married to someone in a shuk, the Vlad is a mamzer. And therefore, the Gemara is hard-pressed. Why do you have to tell me ben Arichon, ben Achron? Before she knew, after she knew, it's irrelevant. The facts on the ground speak for themselves. She is a Yevamot Ashur. Therefore, the Vlad is a mamzer. And it seems to me that the Gemara doesn't have an answer to this question. And the only way that we can find a justification for both min harishon and min ha'achron is through what we call ID. ID means by the by. There's no chiddush. There's no compelling reason that the Mishnah had to mention bein lifnei shvua, bein li'achar shvua, rishon and achron. But sometimes the Mishnah will add something in order to say ID, meaning to have symmetry, which comes later in the Mishnah, or that which comes earlier in the Mishnah. And to create a solid and uniform structure in the Mishnah, we add things to the Mishnah, even in parts of the Mishnah which aren't necessary. And the Gemara says, this first segment of the Mishnah is a segue into the second scenario of the Mishnah, which is called the Sefer. Amrullah meis bailach v'niseis. Aiden testified that her husband died, and she went ahead and got married. The achrakach amrullah kayim hay. Then in truth, at the time of your nisuin, your husband was still alive. The achrakach makes. And then her husband died. Now I need the Mishnah to talk about Rishon and Ach. Because Bishleim of the Rishon, meaning he was born, let's say he was in a pregnancy state, right? An embryo. At the time that her husband was alive, he's a mamzer. But the Mishnah wants to say, Afilu min ha'achron, which means that even afterwards, when her husband, and this time again we got it right, he actually died, if she became impregnated, the child is a mamzer. A Rishon, mamzer. So we understand that the Rishon is a mamzer because, again, at the moment of her pregnancy, when she married the second guy and became pregnant, her husband was still alive. But Ribono Shalom, after her husband dies, if she becomes pregnant, where's the Yisrei Shasish? Where's the Ereva? What's going to generate Manseras? Okay, the Rabbanan may say he has to divorce her. But the Rabbanan did not go as far as to say that the child from such a relationship would be a mamzer. A Rishon mamzer, a Achron, Eino mamzer. So since the Mishnah had to mention both the Rishon and the Achron in the latter part of the Mishnah in the Sefer, therefore, in order to maintain a symmetry, the Mishnah in the first segment tells me, Min Rishon and Achron, even though there's no chidush. Ananami Rishon, Rishon Liachron, Mamzer. Okay, now the Gemara now quotes a brisa, and this brisa is meant to shed a light on our mission. We're talking about a Yevama, and she doesn't know that she's a Yevama. The testimony that she relied on had it that her husband died first and the Vlad died second, which means she's not a Yevama. Unbeknown to her, she's a Yevama. She went ahead thinking that she's not a Yevama, relying on those two Eidim, got married to someone else. Adam min hashuk. Now, the Eidim testify chiluf hadvarim, that as a matter of fact, you were a Yevama l'shuk because your husband died second. And the Mishnah says the Vlad is a mamzer. Honor Rabbanan, says the Brisa. That's not necessarily so. We read the Mishnah and we come to a mistaken conclusion, thinking that there's no doubt that the Vlad is a mamzer from this relationship that she had as the Yevama l'shuk. Says the Brisa, so divrei Rabbi Akiva. Aval Chachamim Omrim Ein Hamam Ein Mamzer Miyavam. What does this mean? Steve, you'll remember this. We spoke about this not long ago in Masechet Yevamot. John, you'll remember it too. There's a major controversy about two issues that are really one. It's just two sides of the same coin. When the Torah prohibits a man from marrying a woman, if he goes ahead and violates the law of the Torah and marries her, does the halacha, does the Jewish legal system recognize the validity of that marriage? It's one thing to say, well, he deserves to be tarred and feathered and punished for violating a Torah law and marrying a woman who's forbidden to him. But it's quite another thing to say that Ein Kiddushin Tofsin, that we don't recognize the marriage. Do we recognize the marriage? That's the great bone of contention between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. The Chachamim say it all depends. What is the nature of the Isur? We have two different levels. We have actually many different levels, but fundamentally two levels. There's Chayve Krisus and below Chayve Krisus. For example, Chayve Lav. Say the Rabbanon, in a case of Chayve Krisus, that's called an erva, and the Kiddushin is not Chal. The marriage is not valid. A man marries his own sister, the halacha doesn't recognize that marriage. But if it's Chayve Lavin, then again he deserves etch, for violating the lav, but the marriage is valid. She's a full-fledged Eshes each. Now we get to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, no. Ein Kiddushin Tofsin b'chayve lav. And that's going to have a direct impact on our sugya of Yevamot Ashur, because the Torah prohibits her as a Yevama until she gets chalitza to marry another man. And that prohibition is an Isur Lav, like any Isur Lav. Therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, against the Chachamim, you're going to tell me Kiddushin Tofsin? We're going to validate the marriage to a Yevamot Ashur because it's only an Isur Lav? No. Ein Kiddushin Tofsin b'chayve lav. Now we get to the spin-off of that machlokas, and that is what's the status of the child. And here we say, you're familiar with the Talmudic phrase, ha b'hatal. The status of the child, is the child a mamzer or not, depends upon whether Kiddushin Tofsin or Ein Kiddushin Tofsin. If the relationship between the father and the mother is Ein Kiddushin Tofsin, such that the Torah would not recognize their marriage, for example, Chayve Krisus according to the Rabbanan, Chayve Lavim according to Rabbi Akiva, then the child is a mamzer. But if the Torah recognizes that marriage, then even though it's a forbidden violation of the Torah law, the child is not a mamzer. Hence, according to the Rabbanon, if a man marries Chayve Lavim, the child is kosher. It's not a mamzer. Tremendous machlokas that has repercussions throughout Masechet Yevamot and all of Seder Noshim. And here in our Mishnah, the way the Brisa interprets it, our Mishnah is reflective of the Shita Rabbi Akiva. That if she went ahead, unbeknown to her, thinking that her husband had died first and she married someone else, but not sure, the child is a mamzer, the Mishnah says. Why is the child a mamzer? Because she was the Yevamot Ashur, and the Torah prohibited her from getting married. But it's only Chayve Lavim, says the Brisa. Our Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. Ein Kiddushin Tofsin b'chayve lavim, and therefore, ipso facto, the child of such a relationship is a mamzer. Aval Chachamim Omrim Ein Havlad Mamzer Mishum she'ein Mamzer Yevama. The Chachamim never accepted that Chayve Lavim undermines the validity of the marriage, and therefore the child is a mamzer. And that's the Brisa clarifying our mission. So the Gemara says the following. Why does the Brisa say, according to Chachamim, Ein mamzer miyavama? Strange language. Yavama is nothing more than one case in Many, many cases, it's just an application of a general rule. And that is that ein mamzer b'chayvei lavin. Because Kiddushin Tovsim b'chayvei lavin. That's the sheet of the Chachamim. The lema ein mamzer b'chayvei lavin. Why do you focus and limit your words to a Yevamot? Yevamot is just simply an application of the general rule of chayvei lavin. It's another case of chayvei lavin. And the Gemara answers, you know what? The Chachamim mentioned in this price are not to be identified as the Chachamim hold that in order to get mamzeris, you need and you must have at least chayvei krisis or above. That's chayvei krisis bezin. But rather, high Tana, this Tana called the Chachamim in the Brisa. Hach Tana de Rabbi Akiva. This is a Tana who came from the Beis Medrash of Rabbi Akiva. Di Omar, mechayvei lavim dishar havi mamzer, umechayvei lavim gredi lo havi mamzer. There are two categories of chayvei lavim, and this we've never seen before. We've never encountered a flowchart in which we subdivide chayvei lavim into two major classifications. One is called kirvas mishpacha, which means that there's something in the relative, something in the genealogical relationship that caused the Isser La. And we'll give an example in just a minute. And then we have chayvei lavim grading, which means they have nothing to do with she'er basa. She'er basa means a genetic relative. So let's give a case in which we're dealing with chayvei lavim dishe'er. She'er basa means because of a genealogical relationship. Isha shenensa al yidei aviv. This is called Anusas Aviv. It's a major machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham. Rabbi Yehuda holds that Anusas Aviv has the same identical status as Eishes Aviv, and it's a full-fledged ervo with a chiv karetz. So if a man has a relationship with a victim of his father's rape, that's a violation, according to Rabbi Yehuda, of a chiv karetz. And the Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim say that Eishes Aviv, that's already considered an erva, but not Anusas Aviv. The Torah prohibits Anusas Aviv under a lav. But it's chayvei lavim this she'er. She'er means because he's related to his father, he's therefore related to Anusas Aviv. In such a case of chayvei lavim dishe'er, the child of such a relationship is a mamzer. And that's the Tana de Rabbi Akiva. Tana de Rabbi Akiva means that Tana that interpreted Rabbi Akiva. Now we get to a second classification. Chayvei lavim graded, which means that the Isser that generates a forbidden relationship here has nothing to do with a father, a mother, an uncle, or any of the genealogical relatives. In such a case, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that the child is not a mamzer. Let's take the case of a Yevamot Ashuk. A man from the Shuk, any man, marries this woman. Is there any relationship, any genealogical relationship that would prohibit his marriage to this woman? No. All that you have is that she needs yibum, and zikas yibum prohibits her from marrying anyone other than the other. But when this person in Ashuk marries her, he's not violating chayvei lavim dishe'er. It's not she'er. He's not allowed to marry her because the Torah says he can't marry Yevamot Ashuk, but not because he's related to her in any way. He's a fremder, as we say. He's a foreigner. He's alien to this relationship. And in such a case of a lav, she'eno machmas kirvus mishpacha, the vlad is not a mamzer, even according to Rabbi Akiva. And therefore, there's no need to assume that when it says in this brisa, Avol Chachamim Omrim Ein Mamzer B'Yevamot, what they meant to do is invoke the sheet of the Chachamim of Rabbi Akiva. The sheet of the Chachamim is Ein Mamzer B'Chai B'Lavim. And Yevamot is only one case in point. But our brisa is authored by the Tana of Rabbi Akiva, meaning the Tana who explained, according to his understanding, the sheet of the view of Rabbi Akiva. And he understood that even Rabbi Akiva would differentiate between this case of Yevamot Ashuk and other Chayvei Lavim, like Anusas Aviv. Whereas in Anusas Aviv, the child would be a mamzer according to Rabbi Akiva, despite the fact that it's Chayvei Lavim. That's only because it's Chayvei Lavim d'She'er. And the son, his relationship to this woman is like that of my father's mother, so to speak. Even though my father's wife, even though he never married her, it was only an anusa situation. But that intimacy creates a kind of a quasi-ishus relationship, which the Torah prohibits the ben from having a relationship with his father's anusa. That's called she'er. That's a relationship through him to this woman because of his father. And that's where Rabbi Akiva says Chayvei Lavim are an extension of our rayos because it's she'er. But in our case of the Isur Yevamot Ashuk, according to the Tana of Rabbi Akiva, limited Rabbi Akiva, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that the child is not a mamzer. And therefore the Brisa says very well that our Mishnah is Divrei Rabbi Akiva, when the Mishnah says that the Yevamot Ashuk had a child, the child's a mamzer. That reflects the sheet of Rabbi Akiva before the time of Rabbi Akiva, before we restricted the application of Rabbi Akiva, that assumed that all Chayvei Lavim, according to Rabbi Akiva, engender mamzeros. And therefore our Mishnah makes sense. However, Avol, Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim of Rabbi Akiva, they had a different view of Rabbi Akiva. They limited the application of Rabbi Akiva to a she'er, but in a Chayvei Lavim, that's not she'er like Yevamot Ashuk. Even Rabbi Akiva agrees that there's no mamzerus, and then we can't work out our Mishnah. So our Mishnah, at a three possible shittas, can only work out according to one of the three. It certainly can't work out according to the Chacham of Rabbi Akiva who hold that Kiddushin Tosu v'Chavei Lav v'Ein Mamzeres v'Chavei Lav. It could reflect the extreme sheet of Rabbi Akiva, who, in an all-encompassing way, held that Chayvei Lavim always, under all circumstances, generate Mamzerus. It cannot work out to the Tana de Rabbi Akiva, who has a compromise shita and rewrites Rabbi Akiva in a limited way that he only applies his principle of Chayvei Lavim and Mamzeres to a case of she'er, but he doesn't apply it to a case of Chayvei Lavim she'eno she'er. Now, just by way of a 2-minute introduction to what we want to talk about in Mr. Shem in the next sugya, is it possible that there is mamzerus in Yevamot Ashuk according to everyone? It doesn't even mention, you don't even bear mentioning Rabbi Akiva, and not even in the Tana de Rabbi Akiva, even though Yevamot Ashuk is not she'er, nevertheless there would be mamzerus. And even according to the Chachamim, who say that Ein Mamzeretz B'chayvei Lavan would agree that Yevamot Ashur is the exception to the rule. Can anybody think of one word that would explain what I'm saying? It's got 4 letters in it, in Lashon Kodesh. What would be the hamamim, the logic that would cross your mind? I'm just sort of testing you. I'm trying to squeeze your brains here a little. That Yevamot Ashur, the child is a mamzer. Even though we hold Ein Mamzeres B'chayvei Lavan. This is the exception to it. So I think you forgot my introduction to Masechet Yevamot. Well, of course, that was a long time ago. And I said that you could rewrite the name of this Masechet. Instead of Masechet Yevamot, you could call it by a different name. A word in Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, that has 4 letters. At least has 5 letters, I think. Last time I looked. Unless it's chaser without a U. I don't know. I'll give you more of a hint. It's a 4-word letter that starts with a Zion. Zika, excellent. This is Masechet Zika. Call it Yevamos if you like. What is Yibum? Yibum is Zika. Zika means that a man dies without children. And there's a relationship between his wife, his surviving wife, the Almana, and his brother. That relationship is a Zika relationship. And it's quite possible, by the way, that Yibum doesn't even require kavanah. Tell the Yavam some hunky-bory story, just invent a story that by being miyavim her, he's divorcing her. I know, just convince him. He would still make her into an Ashes because of the power of Zika. To some extent, as strange as this sounds to our ears, her Isha's relationship to Reuven, who's no longer alive, continues in the form of Shimon. Shimon steps into the shoes of Reuven. And he picks up this Ishus. It's not a complete Ishus, but it's 50%, maybe even 70% of Ishus. All that's missing is the clincher, which is Yibum. Otherwise, he can divorce her, and that's called Chalitza. But it's all based on Zika. A Yevamot Ashur is a quasi-Ashes Ish until she gets Chalitza. She is, so to speak, tied down with an Isha's relationship to the brother who's alive, or to many brothers. When someone from the Shuk has a relationship with her, to some extent, he is having a relationship with an Ashes Ish. And that's a whole new story. That's already Mamzeros. And then we don't go into any detail about Chavilav Mahin, Chavilav Naher. It's totally irrelevant. And therefore, as we'll soon see, which is again the Gemara here inside Beis on Rav Yehuda, on Rav Minayin She'ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'Yevamot. We cannot recognize a marriage relationship with the Yevamot. And Rav is going to derive this from Psukim in the Torah. And as we said before, Haba Hatali, if you remember, if there's no Tvisas Kiddushin, then the child from such a relationship is a mamzer. And what is Rav saying? Ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'Yevamot. What are you talking about? We're talking about Chayvei Lavan. We paskin like the Chachamim against Rabbi Akiva. And even Rabbi Akiva might agree that Ein Mamzeres B'Chayvei Lavan in a case of Lav to She'er, when it's not a She'er relationship. So what are you telling me? That Ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'Yevamot Ashuk? Chayvei Lavan. And as a result, the child is going to be a mamzer. Okay, then? So that's where we'll take a pause.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, Ben, this is where we're going to stop for today. Tomorrow we'll talk about Rav, Emir Hashem, on the top of Study base, moment base. Okay, then, wishing you a great day.